Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This one is titled The God of Lies. And if you haven't seen any of these episodes before, what we're doing is we are going to scryfall.com, randomly selecting a card from Magic the Gathering, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck around the theme of the chosen card. Now this week's theme, or this week's card, was a pretty fun one. We actually wound up getting a pretty new card and a commander in Valki God of Lies / Tibalt Cosmic Imposter. So, Valki is 1 and a black for a legendary creature god, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals their hand, and we exile a creature card for each opponent that is revealed this way until Valki leaves the battlefield. And we can pay X to turn Valki into a copy of a creature with converted mana cost X. Honestly, we're probably not even going to cast the front side of this. We're really in this for the back side, which is Tibalt Cosmic Imposter, which is a 7 mana planeswalker, comes in at 5 loyalty, and as it enters the battlefield, we get an emblem that says we may play cards exiled with Tibalt Cosmic Imposter, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. His +2 exiles the top card of each player's library, -3 exiles target artifact or creature, and his -8 exiles all cards from all graveyards, adding 3 mana. So I was super excited to get this card, mainly because I've wanted to play with Tibalt for a little while, but couldn't quite figure out how to do it. So I sat down, looked at this deck, and we went pretty heavy onto the stealing our opponent's things theme, whether that's plussing Tibalt to steal the top card of everyone's library, or eventually, hopefully, ultimating Tibalt, exiling all cards from all graveyards, and being able to win by just playing everyone's best cards. So, I'm sure it's pretty self-explanatory at this point, but our commander for this deck is also Tibalt Cosmic Imposter and Valki God of Lies. It's a bit of a rule for the Commander's Guild that if we hit a legendary creature as our random card, it has to be the commander. So, we're running with Valki and Tibalt today. And some of our major themes in this deck. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about one already, stealing things. Thieving Amalgam is a good example of this. It's 5 black for a 6/7 ape snake. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, we manifest the top card of their library. And whenever a creature we control but don't own dies, its owner loses 2 life and we gain 2 life. Now, that bottom line of text doesn't just apply to the manifest creatures. If we're able to steal a bunch of cards with Valki and put them into play under our control, and then someone board wipes, we still get those triggers. So stealing our opponent's things is a big theme for us in this deck. The second big theme is protecting ourselves. Obviously, with our commander being a planeswalker and stealing a lot of stuff from other people, we're going to become a bit of a target, bit of a threat. People are going to want to attack us. So we have plenty of ways of making sure that our opponents can't attack us. Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs, for example, 3 red for an Ogre Warrior. He's a 5/4. And whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, if we are the defending player, we make a 3/3 Ogre unless they pay 3. Basically giving us a blocker if they can't afford to pay it. And if they can afford to pay it, we're at least tapping them out of a little bit of mana. And it's super useful if we have multiple copies of this type of effect on board. And our last major theme for this deck can kind of be seen with Faithless Looting. We have a lot of reanimation style cards and a lot of reanimation style effects. So if we are able to draw some cards, throw some cards into our graveyard, we might be able to get cards like, say, Thieving Amalgam onto the board for much cheaper than what it actually costs. Being able to fill up our graveyard and cast it later, or even just filling up our graveyard in the hopes that we can ultimate Tibalt, and then getting all those cards back and being able to cast them again. Now, since we have our themes out of the way, we're going to take a look at some key cards in this deck. And the first key card that I want to mention is Stolen Strategy. It's 5 mana for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library, and until the end of turn, we may cast non-land cards from among those exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. So this is a repeatable steal effect that not only steals the cards and we can cast them this turn, but it puts them into exile, meaning that even if we don't cast them, our opponents won't be able to cast them either. So it's a permanent getting rid of it. We don't have to worry about it going into their graveyard and them being able to abuse it later. And if they can't get rid of this card, this is just a huge value engine that we can keep rolling through with the rest of the game. Our next key card is Dream Devourer. Now, as I'm sure we've kind of seen, Thieving Amalgam, 7 mana, Kazul, 5 mana, Stolen Strategy, 5 mana. There's a lot of expensive cards in this deck. And we're in Rakdos. We don't ramp super well, so we have Dream Devourer that says each non-land card in our hand without Foretell has Foretell, and its Foretell cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 2. And then it also has a text that, honestly, we're not super concerned about, that whenever we foretell a card, Dream Devourer gets +2/+0. That's probably not going to be super relevant, but being able to turn our 5-drop into a 3-drop in a couple of turns gives us a much better chance of being able to cast multiple things, being able to make use of maybe some things we've stolen with Stolen Strategy, and also casting something we have for less mana, and it just helps us ramp a little bit in a weird way. And then finally, our third key card, a card that's actually shown up quite a bit on the Commander's Guild, is Sir Conrad the Grim for a 5-mana Human Knight 5/4. Whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. So, the important part here is that it triggers when people die, when creatures die, or when creatures are put into the graveyard from anywhere. That means if we ever kill our opponent's creatures, which we have plenty of ways to do, if we ever board wipe, which we again have plenty of ways to do, or whenever a creature leaves our graveyard. So if we ever get to Ultimate Tibalt and we exile everyone's graveyards, we're exiling all the creatures out of our graveyard, which means Sir Conrad might trigger 5, 6, 7 times, doing a big chunk of damage to our opponents. So, as I was going through and building this deck, I found a couple of cool interactions. The first one is actually inspired by a very recent card, also from Kaldheim. It's Rise of the Dreadmarn and Blasphemous Act. So, Blasphemous Act is a 9-mana sorcery that costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, and it deals 13 damage to each creature, basically destroying everything. There's very little that's going to survive a Blasphemous Act. And we also have Rise of the Dreadmarn, which is 3 mana, or we can foretell it and then cast it for 1 black. And we create X 2/2 black zombie berserker creature tokens, where X is the number of non-token creatures that died this turn. So if there are more than 8 creatures on the board, and we've foretold Rise of the Dreadmarn, we could, in theory, kill all creatures on board and get a ton of zombies for only 2 mana. Now, obviously, that's a bit of a dream scenario. That's probably not going to happen super often, but it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to get at least a few zombies from Rise of the Dreadmarn, especially because Blasphemous Act is not the only board wipe in our deck. It's just the most mana efficient if there are more than 8 creatures on board. The next interaction that I found was between Carter Doomscourge and Rakshasa Debaser. So, Carter Doomscourge is 2 black-red for a 4/3 Demon Berserker, and when he enters the battlefield until our next turn, creatures our opponents control attack each combat if able, and attack a player other than you if able. They're basically goated. And whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. That second line of text doesn't need to be in the next turn. That's just forever. But the reason that's so good with Rakshasa, it's a hard word to say, Rakshasa Debaser, is that Rakshasa Debaser is a 4 black cat demon for a 6/6, and whenever it attacks, we put target creature card from defending player's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control, and it has Encore for 8. So if we cast Carder first, all of our opponents have to attack each other, there's probably some creatures that die, and our opponents are no longer able to block because most of their creatures have attacked. So if we can then send in Rakshasa Debaser, steal something from one opponent, or encore it, stealing something from each opponent, we've probably given ourselves access to at least something pretty good from each opponent without having to do too much work. Alright, so that brings us to the deck price for this. It was not super expensive, $97.07, so we were getting pretty close to our budget limit, but we didn't cross it, and unsurprisingly, our most expensive card in the entire deck was our commander, Valki, at $13.61. Obviously, this would be the point where I'd tell you, hey, you can cut this card if you want. Obviously, it's kind of hard to cut the commander of a deck. There are other Rakdos commanders that could fit in this slot, but honestly, the deck is very fine-tuned to what Tibalt wants to do. So if you were to replace Tibalt trying to save some money, it probably wouldn't be the same deck, unfortunately. But what we are going to do now, we've gone through the deck tech. We are going to get into a bit of gameplay with some returning guests on the channel. We are going to run up against 3 commanders. We've got Adrix and Niv, twin casters, played by Bilal, Izoni, Thousand-Eyed, played by Jason, and a partner pairing of Timna the Weaver and Rograk, son of Roga, played by Shawn. Now, I've played against Izoni before. She's the only one out of these commanders I've actually played against, and Izoni is a very scary deck. There's a lot of aristocrat triggers and a lot of token making and graveyard shenanigans. So I'm hoping that Izoni might mill themselves a lot, not worry too much about Tibalt, and then we can steal their graveyard. So that's goal number 1 there. Adrex and Nev, I'm not quite sure what to expect out of this. I guess it would be tokens, since it creates twice as many tokens. It's basically like a doubling season in the command zone. I'm not quite sure that's going to be super helpful for us if we're exiling their graveyard, but you never know. And then the last one, Timna the Weaver and Rograk. This one is the one that probably scares me the most. Rograk, very cheap creature. Timna, very cheap creature. I would imagine that this is a very aggressive deck. I'm hoping we can put up some defense, because a lot of our defense tends to sit around 4 to 5 mana, and at that point Rograk might be more of a threat than we can handle. But hopefully it goes well. So we will jump into that game now, and I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you guys after the game. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Jason, Shawn, and myself. On his first turn, Bilal plays a Quandrix Campus, Jason plays a Swamp, Shawn plays a Swamp, and then casts Rograk, and then casts Bone Splitter. I play a Sulphurous Mire. Bilal plays an Island. Jason plays a Forest. Shawn plays a Plains, and then equips the Bone Splitter to Rograk, and attacks Bilal for 2 with his commander. I play a Swamp, and then cast Rakdos Signet. Bilal plays an Island. Jason plays a Swamp, and then casts Yahenni, Undying Partisan, and since the vampire has haste, he attacks me for 2. Shawn plays a Mountain, and then casts Timna. He then attacks Jason for 2, and in his second main phase, he pays 1 life to Timna's ability to draw a card. He then also exiles Simian Spirit Guide to cast Flayer Husk. On my turn, I cast a Palladian Mirror. I then play a Temple of Malice, scrying 1 to the top. Bilal plays an Island, casts a Soul Ring, and then casts Fairy Artisan. Jason plays a Forest, and then casts Journey to Eternity, enchanting Yahenni. Shawn plays a Plains, and then moves to combat, attacking me with 2 with Rograk, and then in his second main phase, pays 1 life to Timna to draw a card, then cast Short Sword and Norn's Annex. On my turn, I play a Mountain, and I cast the backside of Valki, Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter from the command zone. When he enters, I make an emblem that says I can play any cards exiled with Tibalt, and I then +2 Tibalt to exile the top card of everyone's library, hitting a Karn's Temporal Sundering, Nyx Weaver, Windscarred Crag, and Soul Shatter. On Bilal's turn, he casts AC, Tyrant of Gyre straight, and then plays an island, drawing a card with AC. He then attacks Tibalt for 2 with Fairy Artisans. On Jason's turn, he plays a Grim Backwoods, and attacks Tibalt for 2 with Yeheni. In his second main phase, he casts Awakening Zone. Shawn plays the Plains, equips the short sword to Timna, and then attacks Bilal for 2 with Rograk, Jason for 1, and Tibalt for 3, killing our commander. In his second main phase, he pays 2 life to draw 2 cards with Timna, and then casts a Tormenting Voice, discarding a card and drawing 2. On my turn, I cast Jason's Nyx Weaver from Exile, which makes Bilal a token copy as well with the Fairy Artisans, and then I cast Sign in Blood, losing 2 life to draw 2 cards, and playing a Swamp. Bilal, in his upkeep, mills for 2 because of Nyx Weaver, and then casts Idol of Oblivion. He then casts a Hornet's Nest, and then pays 2 life for Norn's Annex, attacking Shawn for 5 with AC. In Jason's upkeep, he makes an Eldrazi spawn with the Awakening Zone, plays an untapped Overgrown Tomb, and then casts Guardian Project. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Mountain, casts a Mace of the Valiant, and then moves to combat, attacking me for 2 with Rograk. In his second main phase, Shawn pays a life to draw a card with Timna, and then casts Pacifism targeting AC, preventing it from attacking or blocking, but Bilal counters it with Counterspell. At the end of Shawn's turn, I cast Soul Shatter, forcing each of my opponents to sacrifice their creature with the highest mana value. In response, Jason casts a Rushed Rebirth targeting AC, so that when the Titan dies, Jason is able to put a 5-cost creature into play from his library. Once that resolves, AC, Timna, and Yeheni die. Yeheni returns to play and transforms the Journey to Eternity, and Jason also puts an Underrealm Lich into play with the Rushed Rebirth, drawing 2 cards from Guardian Project. This also replaces Bilal's Nyx Weaver with an Underrealm Lich, and at the end of turn, Bilal taps Idol of Oblivion to draw a card. In my upkeep, I mill 2 to Nyx Weaver, and then I cast Blasphemous Act. In response, Shawn casts a Path to Exile Bilal's Hornet Nest, and then before the board wipe resolves, Bilal and Jason both pay 4 life to make their Underrealm Liches indestructible, and Jason sacrifices his Eldrazi spawn to make Yeheni indestructible. This also puts 5 counters on Yeheni, and then the board wipe finally resolves. I then cast a Beacon of Unrest, putting AC into play under my control. Then I play a Terramorphic Expanse, drawing a card. I crack it for a Mountain, drawing another card. And then I play a Swamp, drawing a 3rd card. On Bilal's turn, he draws a card, but triggers the Underrealm Lich, looking at the top 3, putting 1 to hand and 2 to the graveyard. He then casts a Zendikar Resurgent. On Jason's turn, he triggers Underrealm Lich, and then he makes an Eldrazi spawn in his upkeep thanks to Awakening Zone. He then casts a Casualties of War, destroying Zendikar Resurgent, Norn's Annex, my untapped Swamp, and AC. With that on the stack, I cycle a Barrenmoor, and the spell then resolves, and Yeheni gets a counter. Shawn plays a Swamp, and casts Lurrus of the Dream Den. He then casts Rograk from his graveyard, and moves to equip Short Sword and Bone Splitter to his commander. On my turn, I cast Iron Mirror, I then cast Viscera Seer, and then Plague Crafter, forcing everyone to sacrifice a creature, killing my Plague Crafter, Bilal's Underrealm Lich, an Eldrazi spawn, and Lurrus, and Yeheni gets 3 counters put on it. On Bilal's turn, he casts his commander Adrex and Nev, and then he casts Plea for Power, with the table voting to have him draw 3 when it resolves. He then plays a Thornwood Falls, gaining a life. In Jason's upkeep, he makes an Eldrazi spawn, triggers Underrealm Lich, and then moves to cast a Culling Ritual in his first main phase, destroying each non-land permanent mana value 2 or less. In response, I sacrifice both of my creatures to scry twice, keeping a card on top. Shawn then responds by casting Boros Charm, making his board indestructible. The spell then resolves, and as a quick note, we accidentally missed my Rakdos Charm. Jason then casts a Glowspore Shaman and a Skull Prophet and attacks me for 13 with Yahenni. Shawn casts a single combat, destroying all creatures except for Adrex and Nev and Yahenni, and he then equips the Mace of the Valiant to Rograk. On my turn, I play a Windscarred Crag, gaining a life, and pass. Bilal plays an island and casts Primal Vigor, doubling all tokens and counters. Jason, in his upkeep, makes 2 Eldrazi spawn thanks to the Primal Vigor, and then attacks Shawn for 13 with Yahenni. Shawn casts an Open the Vaults, returning all enchantments and artifacts from all players' graveyards into play. On my turn, I cast Tibalt from the command zone, and then activate Tibalt's +2 to exile the top card of everyone's library, hitting 3 lands and a Splinter Fright. I then play a Rakdos Carnarium, returning Temple of Malice to hand. On Bilal's turn, he plays an island, sacrifices Idol of Oblivion, making 4 10/10s, and then casts Walk the Aeons. In response, I counter it with a red elemental blast. He then casts Eternal Witness, drawing a card with Zendikar Resurgent, and puts Walk the Aeons back to hand. At the end of his turn, Jason uses the Cave of Eternity to return Underrealm Lich to play. In Jason's upkeep, he makes 2 Eldrazi spawn, and triggers the Underrealm Lich. He then casts Spider Spawning, making 10 spiders, before casting a Dawn Treader Elk, drawing a card with Guardian Project, and also playing a Necro Blossom Snarl, revealing a swamp from hand. Shawn casts Kedis Emberclaw Familiar, recasts Tymna, and then attacks me for 8 with Rograk, also doing 8 damage to Jason and Bilal thanks to Kedis. And in his second main phase, he pays 1 life to draw a card with Tymna before playing a swamp and passing. On my turn, I play a Temple of Malice, scrying 1 to the top, and then I activate Tibalt's +2, exiling 3 lands and a Massacre Girl. I then cast Karn's Temporal Sundering, bouncing Zendikar Resurgent to hand and taking an extra turn. Once that resolves, I cast Massacre Girl to wipe the board of all other creatures. In response, Jason sacrifices his Dawn Treader Elk to put a basic land into play tapped. I then pass to my extra turn. On my extra turn, I ultimate Tibalt, exiling everyone's graveyard and getting 3 red mana. I then play a swamp, I cast Jason's Underrealm Lich, as well as Jason's Yahenni Undying Partisan. I then attack Bilal for 4 and Jason for 2. On Bilal's turn, he casts Body of Research, making 2 146 power fractal creature tokens. He then plays an Exotic Orchard, before casting Walk the Aeons, but I again counter it with Red Elemental Blast that was exiled with Tibalt. On Jason's turn, he plays a Swamp, and makes 2 Eldrazi spawn in his upkeep. He then casts Cavalier of Thorns, drawing a card from Guardian Project, revealing the top 5 cards of his library, putting a land into play from among them. Once that resolves, he casts Catacomb Sifter, drawing a card and making 2 Eldrazi spawns. He then casts Grapple with the Past, milling 3 and returning Zulaport Cutthroat to hand. On Shawn's turn, he recasts Rograk, casts a Dark Ritual, casts Village Rites, sacrificing Rograk to draw 2, recasts Rograk again, and then casts a Thaumatic Compass before equipping Rograk with Short Sword and Bone Splitter. At the end of his turn, Thaumatic Compass transforms into Spires of Orazca. And as a quick note, unfortunately Bilal had to leave at this point, so we continued as a 3-person game. On my turn, I trigger Underrealm Lich, before activating Tibalt's +2, exiling a Caustic Caterpillar, Commander Sphere, and Arcane Signet. I then cast a Carter Doom Scourge, goading all of my opponent's creatures, before casting a Rakshasa Debaser, and paying 2 life to attack Shawn with Massacre Girl, forgetting about the Spires of Orazca, because it is then removed from combat with the Spires of Orazca. On Jason's turn, he makes an Eldrazi spawn thanks to the Awakening Zone, cycles a Tranquil Thicket, plays a Forest. He then casts a Zulaport Cutthroat, drawing a card. He casts a Grisly Salvage, putting a Blood Artist into his hand. He then casts the Blood Artist, drawing a card. And casts a Viscera Seer. In response, I cast Tibalt's Trickery, countering the Viscera Seer, milling Jason for 3, and letting him cast a Golgari Signet for free. Jason then activates the Cave of Eternity, returning Beladros Witherbloom to play, and then pays 10 life to untap all of his lands, and reactivates Cave of Eternity, returning Viscera Seer to play. Then he casts his commander Izoni, making 3 insects, and at this point he sacrifices most of his board, draining and killing me with the Blood Artist and Zulaport Cutthroat, and then casts an Assassin's Trophy, destroying Rograk, and Jason moves to combat, paying 4 life to attack Shawn with Cavalier of Thorns and Catacomb Sifter, winning him the game. Alright, so that was a super fun game. Unfortunately, Bilal had to leave right at the end there, but he didn't miss too much. We wrapped up the game literally the turn after that. So, nothing too fancy, just a lot of Rograk hitting people, and Adrix and Nev making massive tokens, and Izoni doing aristocrat things. I was super happy that we got to Ultimate Tibalt at least once, and honestly, if we were playing in person, it might have been a little bit easier. Playing over webcam, it was difficult to know what was in everybody's graveyards and knowing what cards I had access to, but if I play this deck again, I'll probably wait until I'm in person. And if you do decide to put this deck together and play it for yourself, I would recommend probably not playing it over webcam. It's not the most effective deck to play when you can't actually access someone else's cards, but it is a super fun deck. Just be prepared to get hit quite a bit because, you know, people don't like their stuff being stolen. But I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and if you have any suggestions for future videos, please let me know, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.